Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is TJ Kelly. I'm the Communications Director for Race Secure. I'll be your Master of Ceremonies for the day. And we're here to talk about mail security, risk assessment, and standing operating procedures. So let's dive into that. And again, thanks everyone for joining. So before we launch into the whole program, I do want to highlight our subject matter experts here for Race Secure. The first is Will Plummer, our Chief Security Officer. Will's not joining us today, as it would be off topic for him, but I do want to highlight that we do have Will as a resource. He's a 25-year U.S. Army veteran, spent that time in EOD or explosives ordnance disposal. He leads our EOD secure program. So if anyone has any questions about threat detection and general mail security, Will is an excellent resource and we'd be happy to connect you. But today we are joined by Cody Martin, our Director of Mail Security and our SOP team lead. So as an introduction for security for Cody here, Cody is a 12-year U.S. Postal Inspector veteran. He was a dangerous mail specialist and training instructor for the USPIS, trained in hazmat, biohazard, forensic sampling, suspicious substance screening, IED recognition. The list goes on. Cody co-created the USPIS IED recognition and response program for the PIS national headquarters. He was an investigator on multiple high-profile and VIP cases, including former President Obama, New York City former Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and multiple U.S. state governors around the country. He's conducted dangerous mail screening for the NFL, the NBA, former President George W. Bush in retirement, and he was a first responder to hundreds of incidents around the country, including businesses, government agencies, and private residences. So the list does go on. Cody, thank you much for joining us today, and we'll turn it over to you to take it away.
All right, thanks, TJ. First of all, I just want to thank everybody for joining. I know it's this is a nice block of time that you could be working on something else, but you're spending it working on mail security, which is often overlooked, but it's very important. So my objective is to give you the most bang for your buck. We have a limited amount of time to kind of cover a lot of material, so I'm going to be working through this kind of fast in some areas, but my goal is to make sure that you have a complete framework to build out SOPs, or at least get a good start on it while you're there. Before we get into SOPs, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second, we are going to cover risk assessment and risk analysis for your organization and your mail rooms, because that's very important, right? We have to define that criteria. We have to look at those issues before we can build out SOPs that kind of respond to those. Just a couple of short housekeeping rules. We're going to be taking some breaks in here for questions, so please ask questions. If something pops up while we're talking about it, go ahead and shoot a question in on the chat, and we'll make sure and address that for you. As well as I encourage you to take notes, as you know, especially for things that are specific for your organization. You don't have to write down everything on the screen. We're going to be sharing this deck with you with some expanded notes as well. So don't worry about that per se, but if there are specific things as we're working through some of these action steps, please make notes on those regarding your organization, what you want to accomplish, and things of that nature, right? So we want to make sure this is kind of a working session as opposed to me just talking to you. So please submit questions as you see fit. Before we get into this whole thing, let's just talk real fast about the framework or the building blocks of our SOPs, because that'll kind of set the stage for us when we look at risk assessment and those type of things. What we like to do in our SOP process is build it out, and you can kind of see these building blocks on the left side of the screen. So we're going to start out by defining our policy statement, and that's going to set the tone for this whole document. It's going to talk about how we're going to address threats, and then what level, who is it going to apply to, how is it going to affect our organization, right? And that's going to be, again, in response to our risk level and the risk assessment that we conduct. Then we're going to talk about the screening process, and that's basically how mail flows through your facilities or your mail rooms or your organization, what that looks like. And then with those in place, we're going to start talking about our specific SOPs. So what procedures or processes apply to each one of those things. So we'll look at the mail screening in general, like what does just our run-of-the-mill screening process look like? We're going to throw in some elements for executive protection, maybe residential security, because those may be things that affect your organization. So we want to make sure that we highlight those, because there's some caveats that are real specific to that. And then we're going to talk about suspicious item screening. So if we identify something, how do we interact with it? What do we do? And then we're going to kind of wrap it up with emergency response and outlining those things. Keep in mind, I'm going to give you, again, the building blocks, and we're going to kind of provide an outline for each one of these. We don't have the time to fill those all in for each one of you today. There's a lot of people from various industries. So as we're working through this, take notes when things pop into your head on each one of these sections. That way, if you start developing this later, you'll be able to reference that and continue kind of a detailed annotation throughout that process. So that's kind of the building blocks, right? Before we can build any of those out, before we can address any of these SOPs, we have to look at our risk. One thing I like to start with are the high risk industries as defined by DHS. Department of Homeland Security put these out as kind of a guideline, basically saying if your organization falls under any one of these industries, whatever that umbrella looks like, you can be just a small one location, maybe you are, for instance, we're looking at the legal industry. Maybe you are a civil rights attorney in a city. You've worked on some controversial cases. You're known to the public. You've been in the news. You're a high risk target, right? All the way up to folks within the Department of Justice or something at that level, right? Due to the nature of your work, you're falling under that umbrella. You're a high risk industry. Anything within the military industrial complex, looking at construction, just due to the impact that can have on infrastructure, transportation, the list goes on, right? So read through these. If you have any loose connection or fall directly under them, you're automatically going to be high risk, and the other stuff kind of goes to the wayside. So you can make a mental note of that as we're working through this document, and it will help you kind of frame some of the responses to the questions that I'm going to be asking as we move through this. On top of these high-risk industries, we have some additional considerations that you need to look at. Symbolism, location, population. Those are kind of the three we want to highlight. Symbolism. Does your business represent something that symbolizes a polarizing topic or institution or organization, right? For instance, the 2001 anthrax attacks, right? They attacked the U.S. Postal Service, or they utilized the Postal Service to carry those out as and U.S. Postal Service by default kind of, symbolizes American culture, right? That's how we communicate, a written mail. There was a trickle down effect from that. So as a result of the Postal Service, being used to facilitate this crime, now there was these, end users, little old lady, my grandma living in rural Texas, right? She was worried that she was going to get anthrax. I'm trying to explain to her, hey, you're not a target. But as a result of that, right, created fear and panic throughout the entire country. So if your institution symbolizes something, it kind of can induce fear at a large scale, you're a high risk kind of by default. If you're in a location that is more of a high risk target, right, by default, you're high risk as well. If you're in major metros, high density populations, those types of things. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your facilities, where they're located, and kind of work that into these SOPs as we start outlining the various components of that. We do have a couple more considerations and some intangibles you need to look at as well. Have there been previous terrorist attacks? And most people are going to be like, no, my company's never been attacked by a terrorist. However, are you in an area that have had that's had a terrorist attack? Are you in New York City? Outside of terrorist attacks, has your organization relieved any mail-borne threats, mail-borne attacks? Have you had hoax letters, threatening letters, white powder incidents, those types of things, right? If you have a history of that, or if you're in an area, if you are in an area that has a history of that, that puts you at a higher risk level. So we want to talk about those things. Negative press, demonstrations, boycotts, labor disputes, disgruntled employees, all of those things put you at a higher risk level. So if you've gone through major layoffs, you've laid off 1,000 people, there's a likelihood your risk level has increased a little bit, right? And then we want to look at some additional considerations, and these are more physical security related, but facility layout and tenants and access and all of those types of things. If you're in a high-rise multi-tenant building and you have a low risk, you're in a low risk industry, you never make the news, but the business immediately above you, they're in the news all the time. They're very polarizing. They're causing, they're very controversial in the things they're putting out, and they're at a high risk by default. You're right there. You have a little bit of construction material separating you from the folks who are a potential target. That's something you want to consider as well. So just keep those things in mind as you're working through this. One of the things that we're going to provide you, or that you can access on your own if you wish, is the DHS Mail Center Assessment Worksheet. This is just basically a multi-page document that you can get a team together, whether it's your mail screeners, mailroom managers, global security, whoever you see fit. You can take this document and work through it. And it's basically a series of questions, yes and no, with some details and some notes added in there that allows you to kind of get an assessment or run through an assessment of what you have currently. And you can see what gaps, what voids you have, and where you need to fill those with your SOPs. It may take, a few hours to work through, but it really does give you kind of a good idea of where you stand and what areas you need to address. So you can do this after the fact. We'll access it or send it over to you so you have access. If you want to go after it before then, you can reference this manual here that we've highlighted, and then it's on page 40 is where that information starts. So you can do that after the fact when you have time. So last kind of piece of this, right? We've looked at, I've kind of got you thinking a little bit what your risk rating is, what your risk level is, and we typically look at those at low, medium, high. If you automatically fall into that high criteria, you don't have any thinking to do, right? You know where you sit. Those other ones may take a little bit of work just to determine where the differentiator is. I always would say err on the side of caution if you're borderline, but that's going to be up to you and your internal team to do that. But just to kind of make this clear for you real quick, let's use that high risk facility as an example. If you know that you're high risk, you fall into one of those industries, you're automatically going to be assigned to level 3, which is the highest level, okay? So regardless of anything else, you're automatically high risk according to DHS. You see this 3 here, you can hop on down and look at the requirements or basically the best practices that DHS recommends for you. So you'd want to do visual screening, contraband, hoax, explosive, chemical, biological, radiological, all of that, content screening, et cetera, right? That's what they recommend. So high risk, you kind of get all the bells and whistles according to what you should be looking for. For instance, if you have a low risk industry, you're like, hey, we don't meet any of these criteria. We don't have any enemies. Nothing but good things. And you're a level 1, which is low risk. You're going to go over here to your mail center classification and just kind of look at where you fall on size, and this is according to volume, and say you're a low risk. That's a 1. It's a small facility, less than 1,000 mail pieces. That would be 1A. You could go down here and see, okay, I need to do visual, contraband, and hoax. And that according to DHS, that's where we should fall. So this is just provided to you. Hopefully that offers a little clarity. You can kind of look at that just in terms of what you need to be screening for. And that will help you as you're writing out your SOPs at a later date. So keep that in mind. So we've looked at our risk levels. We looked at the potential things that make us a risk. We determined where we fall. We know kind of what things we need to be screening for according to that chart. And now we're going to look at our policy statement. So our policy statement is what is setting up this document to respond to all of the things that we just looked at, those risks, the items we need to screen for, et cetera. Excuse me. What I've done is I've highlighted 3 different options for you to kind of use to work on, right? So option number 1 would be primarily if you want to apply your SOPs globally. So if you want kind of a general mail screening program that you can apply to a headquarters as well as a satellite office, you would kind of start with that one. Option 2 would be if you're just wanting to address high risk sites, right? And option 3 would be high risk targets. So maybe it's an executive protection program, or maybe you just want to provide screening for your head office folks. That's what you would use. So the way that I would encourage you to look through this and maybe take some notes as it relates to your organization is drop down to these 2 bullets here. These kind of apply to all of these, regardless of whether it's option 1, 2, or 3. So basically we like to say, hey, we'll use option 2 for this example. We're going to say, this global mail screening security policy covers all personnel and facilities who receive, screen, and or deliver mail. High risk locations, according to our risk assessment, will have a formal mail screening program, and our lower risk locations will not. According to that, we got here technology systems used. You would interject that into this portion. I know that there's some folks on the call today that have the mail secure device already in house. So you would interject this device into this, just saying, mail screening technology by way of the mail secure device will be implemented at high risk locations. Low risk locations will, utilize visual and tactile inspection and verified chain of custody. You would annotate those few things, and then you would end it with this last bullet here. Consistent with company global mail screening security programs and standards, etc. Right? That kind of wraps up that paragraph. So really, we just want it to be a paragraph that kind of summarizes what we're doing and who we're addressing. Option 1 basically says all mail for the organization gets visual and tactile and chain of custody, and we're going to offer third-party support. That's just across the board, right? Nothing additional, no technology, etc. Option 3 basically outlines that it would be executives or head office folks. Everyone else outside of that group of people are going to get just the visual and tactile and chain of custody. And then you would probably put it here, technology systems will be utilized for executives in head office only, right? So you can kind of see how that works through. As you're looking at these and making notes, I would say, don't be afraid to pick and pull pieces from each one if you want to kind of craft your own message, because there may be some specific scenario that you're trying to address. So feel free to do that. That's just giving you kind of a rough outline of what your security policy should look like. So once you define that and you write it out at the beginning of this document, that's going to set the tone for the rest of these building blocks, if that makes sense. So we've done our risk, we've done our risk assessments, we've defined our policy, we have that in stone now. Next thing we want to look at is mail volume. We make this really simple. We kind of use 1,000 mail pieces as the threshold that you're going to look at, right? So if you have all your letter mail, all your packages, all the flats that come in from US Postal Service, UPS, FedEx, DHL, private couriers, etc. If the volume, that total count is less than 1,000, we consider that low throughput. Anything over that's going to be high throughput. The reason we define those is because for any low throughput scenarios, our recommendation is all of the mail goes through the same screening procedures. So if that's visual, tactile, chain of custody, and screening technology, you would just send everything through there because it's not going to slow you down enough to really affect output or efficiency in the mailroom. So just keep that in mind, right? Less than 1,000, everything should be able to go through the same process without slowing things down. Your number may vary a little bit, but you'll know when you hit that point, right? Anything that is high throughput, so we'll use that 1,000 piece number again. Anything over that, what we recommend is having 2 processes. One process would be for anything that's lower risk with a verifiable chain of custody. So if you order a pallet of staple guns, and that shows up on the back dock and you know who it's from XYZ distributors, you're expecting it, that's pretty much a verified, in my opinion, I would feel comfortable sending that through a low risk scenario where it gets just, hey, we'll give it another quick glance, we'll verify things just one more time visually, and then we're gonna send it on and put it out for distribution. If something comes in and it's addressed to Bob in HR and it's handwritten, it has 4 stamps on there, that's going to raise some concern, right? So we're going to put that through our enhanced screening where we're going to spend a little bit more time on it. We may introduce some technology there. We may have to reach out to a third party to get some advice, but it's going to get more scrutiny. It's going to go through this parallel path before it gets cleared and goes out for distribution. What this does is you'll find that a lot of the stuff coming in is going to be able to be verified and you can push it on through. And then the remaining amount, you can spend more time on it, screen it properly, and still maintain that efficiency. So that's why we want to break those down. As we're looking through this, just keep that in mind, okay? And then executive protection, we highlight that. Typically the mail volume is really low, and that's okay. We don't want to compromise our process for these types of things. So EP work's very fluid, it's dynamic, it's often on the road a lot. You may be working from various remote sites or traveling, etc. We want to maintain those screening standards regardless of what's going on. So what we like to address here is, hey, the volume may be low. We still want to maintain those high level of screening standards. So maybe you need to think through mobile applications and different things like that as they apply to picking up mail, traveling with it, screening maybe at residences, those types of things. So we're going to highlight some of that as we go through our SOPs, but I just wanted to kind of set the stage for it early on. So our mail screening process flow. We've talked about a lot of things so far. We've kind of got our volume sorted out in our heads, right? So make a mental note of that. And now that we have those things worked through, we're going to look at the actual steps, the methods, the techniques, and that type of stuff. And you can see over here on the right side, some key elements. These are the things that we're going to talk about as we work through the rest of this document, right? And we're going to start out with our process here in a minute in SOP number 1. But the things to remember is it starts with the offloading or reception of that in the initial inspection. And we're going to fill in all the meat in the middle here, and it's going to culminate in either distribution or pickup by the intended recipient, however your organization works. So these are the things that we're going to be building out over these next few slides. So before we get into that, do we have any questions? And this would be a good point to just ask for clarity on things that we've covered, or just how they may relate to your organization. But let's take a minute. You can kind of jot down some notes if you need to, and then be sure to send some messages in on the chat if you have those.
So while Cody has a breath and a sip of water there as a break, we don't have any questions come through yet. Please do feel free to submit those if you're interested. And so Cody, all of that, to sum up, is kind of, you know, comprised of the risk assessment. All of that is under the umbrella of assessing risk and moving forward with a more detailed plan once you know where you're coming from. Is that the general understanding?
Yeah, I mean, it's critical to conduct a risk assessment and to be pretty thorough with that, because your SOPs are a direct response to that assessment, and it doesn't really do you any good unless you know what those risk levels are. So it's paramount that you do that as kind of initial step. You know, you get the framework today on what the SOPs will look like, and then we're going to take that risk assessment piece, and then we're going to really detail those out to address those specific concerns. That's kind of the idea.
Okay. Excellent. So reminder, you can keep the questions coming in anytime. You don't have to wait for these breaks. We do have a few more of these, you know, question slides up ahead, but you don't have to wait. If you have anything that comes to mind, please send it over and we'll interject as necessary. But Cody, why don't you launch into our first SOP here?
All right, so SOP number 1, and we'll just get right into this. This is going to be talking about and detailing the mail screening process, okay? That's the whole point of this section, is to kind of really add a formal process to what's going on in a written manner that people can follow and they're kind of held to. So we're not going to write it out in such a detailed fashion that it's kind of impossible to maintain, but we want them to know, here are the steps, here's how it works, here's the sequential order, and this is how things are going to carry out. This is important because we interject our security procedures into this process. So we need to make sure that it makes sense in terms of how it works. Excuse me, before we go, one of the things that you're going to want to put into this document are the definitions of some key threat indicators. These aren't anything that proprietary or that you know, some secret sauce that I have. These are pretty standard industry-wide things that we look for, that I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. However, it is important to put this into the document, because a lot of times you bring in new folks, especially mail screeners, a lot of times can be brought into a situation where they're doing this for the first time in their life. They don't know what dangerous mail is. They don't know what suspicious mail is. They have no idea. And then all of a sudden you start talking about risks and threats and pipe bombs and biologicals, and you know, their eyes get real wide, and now all of a sudden everything's a threat, right? And you have every mail piece that comes through is a potential incident. We don't want that to happen. We want them to be comfortable. We want them to feel confident in what they're doing. So we usually throw these in here just so a new person can look through and say, okay, these are the types of things that I want to be looking for. I need to find things that are outside the realm of what's normal, and that's going to, you know, trigger maybe a secondary response. So our CSO, Will, he likes to talk about how humans are great at change detection, right? So we know what normal is. We get used to seeing what's normal. And then if something's not normal, it kind of stands out. And those are the types of things that once your screeners start working for a while, they will know what normal is, and they'll be able to see if something is not right, or if there's a little quirk that maybe, you know, just catches their attention, and they can escalate this through some enhanced screening if they need to. So highlight these. This is not an all-inclusive list, but put them in the document. Make sure that they know what they are, and you can kind of use these for internal training and stuff like that. But we feel like it's an important component of this block of information. So we have basically 4 different sections that cover kind of the critical aspects of our screening process. The first one's the receiving area. So this is where you take possession of the mail. And again, when I'm talking about mail, I'm talking about everything that comes in an envelope, in a flat, or in a package, right? So that's going to be our main receiving area. Ideally, in the perfect world, we're going to centralize this. So FedEx, UPS, USPS, they all come in to one area. This includes private couriers. I see, you know, over my career, I saw a lot of breakdown in, you know, folks who do really good at receiving kind of your commercial carriers. all in one place. And then a private courier would show up with something and they would be allowed to walk right up and deliver it to a person directly, right? We want to avoid that. So having everything come into one central location is ideal. It's not always possible, but it is ideal. So when you're detailing out your receiving area, maybe that's a small change that you can make, right? Where you can say, hey, from now on, all mail is going to be collected at this point, and that's where it's going to start the process for us. If that occurs, the next thing that you need to detail in this document is an initial visual screening. This is simply a few seconds that you take when you take possession of that mail, just to give it a quick look. So if you go into the back dock and Postal Service has dropped off 4 tubs of mail, it's literally going over to that tub, taking a peek inside. Do you see any, exposed wires, powders, liquids, anything that looks abnormal? If you see it and it's that easy to see, we're not screening each piece, but we're just doing a quick look. We want to stop it right there. I responded to a ton of calls for screening that were caught in this manner, right? They just saw something funny. There was a little bit of liquid pooling up in the corner of a package. They left it on the back dock. They called us out there. I responded, and I was able to screen it before they ever brought it into their facility or their business. So just doing a quick visual, whoever your person is that picks that up, annotating in here that that's what they're supposed to do, and make sure that's just kind of part of their normal routine. Once we pick all this up, we give it a quick visual. It's then ready for transfer. And then we move into what we call our transfer route. Transfer route is something that you're going to want to spend a little bit of time on. It is very important. And what we're talking about is essentially from the point of reception, so your receiving area, to the point the mail gets screened, where does that mail travel internally? Now, it may not just be inside of your organization. For instance, say you're working in an EP role and you go to the post office every day and you pick up mail from a PO box, right? That is your receiving. At that point, you've received that mail. You are now in possession of it. Your transfer route has started. So if you're driving, you have to make 2 more stops, then you pick up the principal, and then you're going to take he or she to another location. Well, now you have unsecured mail in the back of your SUV or your car, and that could be a problem, right? So we have to think through these things. If we're talking about internally inside an organization, are you walking mail through, a densely populated, like a cubicle farm, right? Are you before it goes to screening, are you pushing it through there in a mail cart and potentially cross-contaminating folks with a powder or a liquid? Are you walking by areas maybe that are critical in terms of infrastructure information, with like war shipping and threats like that out there? Are we bringing packages that haven't been screened through sensitive areas where there could be some sort of compromise? So the idea is to just minimize travel. We want to go the shortest route, but we also want to reduce contamination. So that means that the shortest route, maybe if you're a cubicle farm, but we're going to have to bypass that, right, to maintain a little bit of safety. You can also consider time of day, number of personnel on site, things like that. But you want to detail out the transfer route, make sure it's annotated. This is how it's going to travel from the receiving area to the screening room. So that brings us into section 3 of this first SOP, and this is the mailroom security operations. Here are a few things that you want to highlight in this block. So you want to make sure that you annotate that all mail are subject to the screening process, right? And we're going to detail that out, and that also is addressed in your policy paragraph. So you're annotating in there what mail is subject to that. But all mail are going to be subject to the screening process. You want to make sure that you have a minimum of the 3 bullets that are annotated next. So you have to have a visual and tactile inspection. That's mandatory. So we're looking for physical cues. Those characteristics look odd. We're gonna give it a once over to see if there's anything that feels abnormal. Is it lopsided? Can I feel something bunching up in a corner? Things like that. We're gonna confirm that chain of custody, known senders, known carriers. Is there something where we can track who this is coming from and where it's going to? And then we want to make sure that we introduce PPE at this point. You may want to put PPE at the beginning of this block. I usually just add it on at the end. And eye pro, gloves, mask is what we recommend as a best practice. That used to be kind of a hard sell. Now with the current environment, it's a little bit easier to sell people on wearing masks, and it's mandatory in a lot of places. So in addition to threats in the mail, let me tell you, mail is it's gross. It's just nasty. It's gone through facilities and processing and plants and trucks. And it's just, it's a good idea just to wear gloves and other PPE just to address that issue. So this is where you could put specifically what you want in here And for some people, it's just gloves. For some people, it's gloves and mask. Make that decision internally as a team, and then go ahead and add that into this portion so people know what's expected of them. And then the last part of this that you're going to annotate is the distribution. Now, once it's gone through the process, we recommend that all mail's stamped with a formal stamp. And what we mean by that is if you have screened this and you've done a thorough screening, it's a good idea to throw a stamp on there. So when people receive their mail, they know that it's gone through this process, right? So it does a few things. Number one, it gives everybody kind of a, they feel confident that what they're receiving is safe, especially if there's been incidents before or there's stuff on the news. They know that there's screening going on. Number two, it allows them to see if something gets dropped off on their desk and it doesn't have a stamp on it, they know, hey, this has not been screened yet. So we need to make sure that it gets screened, especially for high value targets or people who are in the news a lot more. And then number three, it also works as a deterrent a lot of times. Believe it or not, and you guys may have experienced this already, right? A large or huge trend right now, and what we see a lot is employees receiving drugs in the mail and they're having it shipped to their place of employment, whether they're hiding it from a spouse or something else, right? It's just happening. When they know that there's a mail screening program in place, even though they may not know exactly what's going on, but they know that you are screening for mail, they're going to be less likely to introduce contraband or other dangerous items into your organization. So for me, it's a good idea to have the stamp in place. It kind of puts people on notice. It also lets them know, right? We're doing this on a daily basis, makes them feel confident, and it could, as a side benefit, prevent some problems with people receiving stuff that they shouldn't be. So that's what we talk about on distribution. And of course, that also culminates in either distributing the mail internally or folks picking it up inside, whichever the case may be. We're going to transition what we call SOP 1A, but really this is just kind of a variance of the first one. And we address here some of the EP or executive protection related issues. This is all the same in terms of the process and the building blocks. We still have a receiving area. We still have a transfer route. We still have mailroom operation, right? Which just happens to be wherever you're processing and screening this stuff. And then we have the delivery, whatever that looks like internally, right? So this is all the same. So you're going to annotate those things. The big difference in this block of information, if you're writing this for your company, is that you're going to have less rigid protocols in place. In other words, at your corporate headquarters, you may have a designated mailroom and everything gets screened there. That's easy to annotate in this document. We're no problem, right? For EP folks, you may be screening mail at a variety of locations. Not only that, you may be receiving it in a variety of locations. So you can't have that rigid format for your EP folks. There has to be some flexibility in there to allow them to do their job while also taking care of this potential threat, which comes to the mail. So we want to highlight that and just let you know what some of those things may look like. What I've detailed here is basically section 1, just to give you an idea to get your mind working. So designated mail receiving area, what could that look like? Well, for EP, it could be the back of an SUV, it could be a security room, a guard shack, checkpoint, garage, any other on-site or off-site location. These could vary from week to week, day to day, depending on what's going on. So you want to make sure that you annotate any of these that you need to specifically. If you have certain things that are regular occurrences in regular locations, we want to probably annotate those so that we can build some procedures around those specific points. But for the rest of it, you need to allow them some room to operate and do their job and not be tied down to some specifics that may be hard to abide by. Same thing for the transfer route, screening, distribution, et cetera. Transfer route can change. It could be in the back of a vehicle. You could be pushing it through a property from a guard shack at a perimeter fence to a garage where it's going to be screened. This is where you would detail all of those things as it relates to your particular program, right? So keep that in mind. Any questions on kind of the mail process from receiving the mail to the transfer route to where you're going to screen it at all the way up through distribution and kind of that process?
We did have one question come in, Cody, that is asking about the process for handling executive mail and suspicious mail. I know you just went through the EP, SOP 1A here. Is there any other, processes or further explanation for executive protection programs specifically that, either got skipped in there or, that you could elaborate on?
Right. Yeah. So in specific specifically talking about that, I would say that, our ideal situation is whatever stringent processes and protocols and technology that you have set up inside your facility, say your standalone mailroom, you want to try to replicate that when you're in the field trying to do mobile screening, because you don't want to degrade the screening process. And even though you're on the road half the year, you're compromising, and we don't want that to happen. I would say it's hard to do in some scenarios. For instance, if you have like a fixed X-ray, right? They're huge, they weigh a lot. You may not be able to replicate that when you're mobile, or if you do, you may have to buy another unit for residents or things like that. So it could be hard, it could be costly. Maybe that's what you want to do. For mobile applications, like we have clients that use the mail secure device. They'll throw it in the back of an SUV. They can take it mobile, so that helps bridge some of that gap. But there's really, the problem is that we often find ourselves cutting corners, and we do not want to do that. So we have to build in provisions in that SOP 1A that accommodate. We have a high risk person. We know that what we need to screen for. We know what technology we have. How can we make sure that that's adhered to regardless of where we're at? And that's kind of what you want to think through as you're building that second part of that SOP out.
Excellent. Then one more question before we move on here. Question just came in about the post office in particular. When mail gets routed through there, is anything screened at the post office or by the postal service?
Yeah, so that's always, I get asked that a lot, and I got asked that a lot whenever I was working for the inspection service. There is screening. I can't tell you exactly what they screen for, right, in DA things, but there is screening, but it is very minimal. It is very minimal, and it is limited to biological threats. And I'll say that with the caveat of the inspection service responds to and screens everything, right? If we get a call, we're going to take care of it. However, we're talking about pre-incident, just standard screening. There's billions of mail pieces a day. There's no way to physically do that. So sometimes employees catch things, and we're thankful for that. But outside of very minimal screening, and for certain types of mail, there's nothing in place. And that's even less for other carriers. And I'm not going to name any names, but there's just not a lot out there industry wide that gets done. Most of everything's reactive.
Okay. We do have a second question here about EP in particular. I think I might hold this one till the end. I don't want to take too much time away from the actual SOPs that you're going through here. Okay. So there's one question here about EP that I will add to the end in addition to a few others, so we can come back on that. And thank you everybody for submitting these. Please keep them coming. We'll queue them up and get through them as we get through them here.
All right, so now that we worked through the process, let's look at suspicious package screening and how we interact with those types of things, right? So suspicious packages. So again, purpose of this is, what do we do if we come in contact and identify a suspicious item? People need to know that. That's always the next big question. So we break this down into 4 building blocks. So how do we validate it? Is it suspicious or not, right? How do we make the situation safe? How can we de-escalate things? Or how do we know when it's time to escalate? So we have a suspicious item. When do we take it to that next level? You want to outline each one of these in this particular SOP. So how to validate? Again, this is not all inclusive. We're just kind of covering some basic stuff here to give you an idea of where to start writing this out, right? So section 1, how to validate a suspicious item. The throwdown answer we like to use your best judgment, use intuition, pay attention to detail. It's true though. I mentioned Will, what he said about change detection and detecting those type of things. As your employees get familiar and comfortable with screening mail, they get used to what's normal, they're going to pick up on a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense. That's going to make them kind of, okay, let's take this to the side. We're going to do a little additional work on it. Maybe verify some of those suspicions, get a second opinion in there. So that's where that kind of thing comes in. And we want to make sure that we kind of annotate some of those things and provide the resources they need to do that. One thing that we can do that we mention here, and you may want to include in your SOP, is something as simple as poster 84, which is most of you have probably seen it. It's a USPS publication, and it essentially has a suspicious package on there that displays a lot of the suspicious characteristics that we highlighted earlier. And it kind of has some text to correspond with it, but especially for new folks, it really provides a visual, kind of as cheesy as that sounds, right? Seeing it every day, it just kind of provides a visual, especially for new people to kind of reference as they're getting more comfortable with the process, right? And we've actually included one of those in this deck that you'll get after this is over. So if you need that, you'll have it. Again, the suspicious characteristics mentioned above, what we want to tell people is we're going to use those as a basis. So anything that fits kind of that weird criteria, That's good enough to initiate the suspicious screening portion. So for me, throughout my career, just little things that people noticed would take it to that next level. And at that point, we can either clear it and get things back to normal, or we can validate that, hey, something is wrong here. Maybe it's not what we initially thought, but there is something that we need to take a look at, and we addressed it that way. So making sure they have access to those, making sure they train those and are comfortable with it. And, a lot of times also, we want to make sure that during the validation process, we don't ever want to jam somebody up for thinking something suspicious and then it's not. Right? We don't want to suppress them doing that. What we want to do is train them and get them comfortable with the process in such a way where everything's not a threat, but if there is one, they feel confident, bringing that to someone's attention or escalating it as it needs to be. One of the other things I would also address in here is possibly giving them the authority to confirm chain of custody. So that could be something as simple as verifying the addressee or the sender, right? We got Bob in HR again. He has this package coming to him that's handwritten with a bunch of stamps on it. It fits all the criteria, right? It's lopsided and weird handwriting, and all of our bells and whistles are going off. What do we do? Well, maybe as simple as saying, hey, giving Bob a call. Hey, are you expecting something from this person? Oh yeah, I ordered that on eBay. It's car parts or whatever. I don't want my wife to know about it, so I had it shipped up here, right? You can clear it that way before we escalate into an emergency response. Seems silly, but having access to information and being able to verify senders and or addressees is just one of those little things that we can do. Section 2, you're going to kind of detail how do you make the situation safe. So if you have a package and it has been deemed suspicious, what are you going to do? You have to, the mail handler or mail screener has to assess the best way to reduce risk to people and infrastructure. We put that down and we put it in here, right? Next thing is, hey, put this suspicious item down, make sure no one else is exposed to it. You want to annotate that. People need to know it. If I pick up a package and I notice powder on my right hand, I don't need to go through the office showing that to people, asking them what they think it is, right? So letting them know, no, put it down. At that point, you're going to secure the room, shut the door, whatever you need to do, go to a decontamination station or to wherever you have deemed necessary, go through some basic decon, washing up, and then we're going to proceed through our emergency response, right? So letting them know those types of things. If there's something in there that, hey, this is a potential explosive device, we see a pipe and we're using some screening technology, we see a pipe on the inside, we probably want to restrict people from going in there, right? So that's going to be paramount, but we also want to take into consideration who's around, who's above, who's below that room. Do we need to remove people just to make this situation safe while we figure out what's going on? So think through those scenarios, and that's where this risk assessment is going to come in. And then you're going to address those in this particular block, okay? Section 3 is how to de-escalate. So we've got a suspicious item, the screener can't clear it. What are they going to do now? They're going to reach out to either corporate security or, third-party experts. Usually it's somebody internally. They want to escalate that up to the next person who's going to give a second opinion. And then at that point, you may engage a subject matter expert. For those of you on the call with the mail secure devices, that would be Will, or his team reaching out to them just to get a second opinion where they can look at images and stuff like that and help make a determination for you. If not, you may have another resource in-house that you've worked out ahead of time. This is where you'd want to build those into these SOPs and make sure they're outlined and highlighted. The other thing that you want to have to help with de-escalation is providing an emergency response card. You want to have some sort of document that allows them to reference it, and they know here are kind of the resources in order of importance, even though it doesn't always have to be adhered to, right? But here's the folks that you have access to and that you can call. Here's names, contact numbers, et cetera, so that they can take care of things, reach out to who they need to reach out to without wasting time trying to track people down. So they also should probably have a reminder there that says you need to capture the following information. And I'm going to highlight that in a minute, but it's like you're going to be transferring some information from what you're observing to maybe your corporate security director or somebody else. So what do you need to capture and what do you need to transfer to them so that they know and have the right amount of information to help you work through that process? So that would be in this step as well. And then we culminate it with how to escalate to an emergency response. So we're going to do this additional review with our internal folks or external support. Now, if the item cannot be rendered safe, we're going to escalate to our emergency response, which we address in SOP number 3. So any questions on the suspicious screening portion, or what we should look for, or what we should do with that?
We do have two questions that came in, but both of them I think are exactly related to this upcoming slide. The first is, what is the escalation process for a suspicious item? You basically just went through parts of that, and I'm sure much of it is also to be covered again. And the second is, when should an emergency response be initiated? So those are almost two different sides of the same question. If that's exactly what's in the next couple slides, I defer to you on which we should just move on, or if you want to address that specifically before this next. But those are two related questions that came in.
No, sure. I think we're going to address most of that. And if not, just shoot us another question if I don't address what specifically you're looking for, and I'll try to take care of it after this next little section. So that's a good segue though. We're going to address an SOP number 3, our emergency response, and kind of the escalation process and what that all looks like. So let's dig into that and see if we can get this highlighted for you guys. Again, this is the process for initiating your emergency response. So this is what really folks are interested in, because that's all they think of when they think about this program, especially your frontline folks, is, what happens if we receive a bomb or a threat. They're thinking like large scale disruptions, right? So we like to break it down again into 4 blocks. You kind of see a reoccurring theme here. Number 1 is the evacuation, then communicating the threat, then risk mitigation, and then calling first responders. Now, when you look at this, it looks a little bit out of order, right? So why would evacuation be number 1 and not the last step in the process? And we are going to address that. I like putting this here, and it's intentional, because if you ever have a situation where you're having a screener and they're maybe having a physical reaction to a mail piece, so they've touched it, their hands are burning, they're having constricted breathing, their eyes are burning, whatever, right? It's emitting vapor, smoke, fumes, any other threatening substance. You don't want them to have to go through a bunch of steps to get assistance, medical assistance, et cetera, or to initiate something to prevent other people from getting harmed. If there's something like this that's going on, you want to enable them to initiate some sort of emergency response, right? And evacuate at least that immediate area if it seems fit. So this is one of the things that you really want to spend a little bit of time outlining, who can make that call and under what conditions. And you may not want to define them specifically. It may be something like, hey, if you're ever at risk for, immediate or imminent threat or physical bodily harm or something like that, or someone around you, maybe a third party working adjacent to you, you can do this. Feel free to do this. Like, you're not going to get in trouble for trying to preserve life and limb, right? So this is what you want to annotate though in this section and make sure people are familiar with it. After that, you want to make sure that you communicate the threat to the security team. So for instance, we don't have to evacuate, it's all good, but we have a package that cannot be cleared. Like, we don't know what to do at this point, so we're getting other people involved. So step 2 is communicating that threat to your security team or whoever is in that chain of custody. And a lot of times, again, this is going to be annotated on that response card, that folks need to know who to contact if they're not the decision maker, right? So they're going to relay all of this information about the threat to whoever they call, and they're going to have to be prepared to discuss those things. So why is it suspicious? What's preventing us from rendering this thing safe? Why can we not, what is going on? So you're going to pass all this information on, or whoever is going to pass it along, and be as detailed as possible. Now, we know how that works, right? So a lot of times information will go to one person, and then this, maybe your global security director is who's going to call 911. Well, there may be a breakdown in some of that communication, right? So you need to make sure you highlight in here, how does the chain of custody work? How does information flow? What are we going to use to exchange information, and make sure that is outlined in this second step, right? So relay information, make sure they know who they're going to talk to. And then the last thing I got on the bullet point here is the final decision on making a call to first responders is the responsibility of the highest ranking security officer or his or her designee, right? This is a placeholder for you. This is where you need to designate who makes the call to bring outside resources physically into our facility, right? So typically it's not the mail screener, but maybe the next person above them, or maybe another level, but that needs to be annotated in here so that we don't have things that are causing disruptions unnecessarily without involving other people. So be sure to detail that in this particular section. The third part is risk mitigation. What we're basically telling them at this point is, hey, we can't expect all of this, but we want you, it's not all falling on you, even though you're carrying the burden of this. We want you to put forth a good faith effort, right? That's all we expect. So we're going to reduce risk. We want to minimize exposure to employees, and you're going to have to take some steps to do that. So for a screener, it's like, oh boy, we've got this bad thing going on. My eyes are burning. What am I going to do? They need to be sure they know how to communicate that to people it could affect immediately, right? So is it through a PA system or intercom system? Is it, do you guys have an emergency messaging system that sends messages out automatically? How do you communicate threats internally if you have to address something? And that's where you would build this process out right here. And then the fourth step would be calling first responders. And I think that's part of one of the questions that you threw in, TJ. And you can look at this in one of two ways. So if you have identified a suspicious package, you've involved corporate security, you guys can't get it cleared. We've talked to third-party support. They've worked through some things. They can't give you a solid answer, right? You internally have decided we are going to call first responders at this point. You have to make a decision who you're going to call. And you do have options depending on where you live. So, for immediate emergencies, if you need assistance right away, we're going to call our local, fire, hazmat, et cetera. Usually that's initiated through 911. This comes with some caveats. It is going to be a much larger response and a much more apparent response from the public's eye, right? Because a lot of times if you say, hey, we have a potential pipe bomb at our office and we're on the 4th floor at this location, you're going to get a lot of first responder activity showing up. Police, fire, medical, et cetera. There's going to be, for a call like that, more than likely EOD is going to show up, especially if you say, hey, we're using some screening technology. We see a pipe and some wires and a power source and all these things in here. They're going to be in a heightened response mode. So you're going to more than likely get evacuated, media attention. People are going to be standing outside for hours, whatever that ends up being. So you got to think about that, right? In contrast, maybe you have an incident where you're thinking, well, this is definitely suspicious and we need to get it cleared. We can't do it. Maybe we need to interject somebody else, but we do not want a large disruption. Maybe that's the point where you can call your local postal inspectors, right? They respond to these things all the time. You're going to make a phone call. They're going to get you on the phone. They're going to do a short risk assessment over the phone. Again, reaching for this information that we talked about earlier, sender, addressee, postmark, suspicious characteristics, all of those things. They're going to make a determination and they're going to tell you, hey, you know what? Stay away from this item, clear out this area. We're going to be there in 45 minutes, right? So you have this time. So that's the difference between the two. Other difference is going to be, they're going to show up in typically just one SUV. They're going to get out, they're going to load all their equipment up on a cart. They're going to roll it into your facility. And it's going to be the same things that like your local hazmat are going to screen for. They're going to do environmental screening, just checking environmental levels. They're going to go in and check for, radiological or any sort of nuclear exposure with like a Ludlum. They're going to do some biological screening. They're going to do trace detection for either explosives, either through swabs or through vapor sampling. They're going to have the portable X-ray if they need to shoot some images of it, things like that, right? But it takes time. And internally, this is kind of where it goes back to using good judgment. You have to make the decision whether you need somebody there immediately or if you have time for a low-key response from someone else. And that's where you're going to address that in this section here. The problem with this is that a lot of times you need to build some relationships up ahead of time. So now's the time to do that. As you're working through these SOPs, find out who your local contacts are. Just contact them and be like, hey, if we have an incident here, maybe it's your local hazmat team, how would you like us to react internally? What would be the best way for us to interact with you to make this process work slower? They're going to tell you kind of what works best, right? And you can kind of detail those things out. But that helps you figure out how and who you need to call and when you need to call them. That's it for SOP number 3. These are the resources that go in conjunction with SOP number 3. Again, poster 84 is, we just recommend throwing that up and letting people have access to it. Just for a reminder, right? For letters and packages, it just kind of a visual, it keeps it on the back of their mind. And then this is an example of what an emergency response card would look like with maybe your security manager, police, fire, your local postal inspector number, any decontamination efforts that you want people to consider if they're in freak out mode and they don't know what to do. And it's like, oh, fire extinguishers here. We have a medical kit. We have decon station, all this kind of stuff. So you would build that out and have it accessible so they can quickly look at it wherever they're screening the mail and then make the appropriate calls to initiate any sort of emergency response. Yeah, so I think that's all of SOP number 3. If we want to take a break for some questions.
Yeah, and we do have a number. If you flip back to that question slide, Cody, there's a list of the questions that folks submitted ahead of time. Some of these have been answered already today. Thank you again to all those who submitted these questions. But let me get to this one question that we got midway through the workshop here about executive protection. So if we could circle back to that, and there are a number of other questions on other topics. So stick around if we haven't hit your topic yet. There are a few others, but this executive protection question is about receiving gifts when an EP agent is out in the field. An EP agent will receive a gift for their principal on a regular basis. So what is the best protocol or practice for transferring that gift from the field to a secure location to to inspect it and screen it? Or how should that work if I'm an EP and I have to worry about this in the field?
Right.
What are my transfer routes and all that? How does that come into play here?
Yeah, sure. No, that's a good question because that happens all the time, right? Ideally, and I mentioned this before and I hit on it a little bit, you want to kind of replicate those screening capabilities when you're on the road. And having those mobile functions, I mean, it's not a pain to get things set up, but it takes a little bit of effort, right, to figure out how you're going to work through things. But this is an occurrence that even, I experienced in my career a lot where those things happen and there's no good way around it. Best case scenario, you have mobile equipment that you can use and screen it before that gift ever gets thrown into a compromising position, or in a vehicle where you're going to be traveling between locations and you just have that exposure. Outside of that, I would say that, you want to, obviously, if you're doing EP work, you're going to have sometimes more than one vehicle. We did, right? So you would want to make sure that's not in the vehicle with the principal, right? So you want to keep that separated, but there are different kind of mechanisms you can use to kind of isolate items, containers where things can be kept somewhat safe. But best practice, my personal opinion is that it needs to be screened before anybody's exposed to it. Yes, we're protecting this person, but also, we don't need any inadvertent risk that we can avoid to any other part of the team as well. So if we have those capabilities just to do a quick scan or something of that nature, we can eliminate some of those threats ideally. If not, then you're going to have to kind of get creative on just minimizing who's exposed from the point of receiving that until you can get some screening in. So that's kind of, it's really situational. And that's why we're talking about the kind of fluid nature of EP work and how you need to leave that somewhat open when you're building out that EP portion of the document.
And this seems like an appropriate time to do a small plug here. This being a Race Secure event, our systems are portable. Of course, we do have a lot of opportunity, a lot of examples of clients who transport them in the back of the SUV, as Cody described. So there are systems out there that can do that. Ours, of course, is one of them. So a small plug, right? There's another question here about asking about real-time evaluation by an expert. You talked a little bit about these third-party supports, third-party experts. That is, of course, a service that we provide for our customers. They've already dealt with Will or have been trained on that. What else can you say about the folks who have a question, they have this response card, and they're trying to rule out, is this a pipe bomb? Is this a hoax? Is this something that looks strange and I just don't know what it is? And how do I decide that? What are my options for that third-party support?
Yeah, so like you said, you either have a vendor, maybe a technology vendor that you're working with that offers that, right? That's one solution. A couple of other solutions is you have to hire someone in-house who is trained and has the experience to make that call. That can be somewhat of an expensive option, but depending on what their roles are, maybe they could do other things as well. But finding somebody qualified to help make those calls can be difficult. Or you can outsource it to third parties, which also is another expense. But there's going to be pros and cons of each of those, but that's kind of the three ways I see you can address it. So either you outsource it, you hire somebody, or maybe it comes as part of a screening package that you're implementing.
Okay. A few other questions here I think have been addressed. There's one about a mailroom hub that could cater to multiple locations. That strikes me as centralized as much as possible and decentralized where you have to. But is there anything else to say about one hub processing all mail for satellite locations?
No, this is actually, it's kind of a good scenario to have because you can implement one set of standards at this location and it can everybody can benefit from that. right? The problem is we have a lot of smaller or low risk sites, and maybe we have one high risk site, but your volume is super high. You may have to implement some pre-sort just because you can't handle all the volume, right? And some of your low risk sites may get a different screening. But ideally, if we have a hub and a central mailroom, we want to, if we have robust screening in place, it's easiest just to apply that across the board if you can handle it efficiently. If you can't, then you need to do some pre-sort type stuff and then filter high risk versus low risk and manage it that way.
Okay. We also have one here about should my organization openly communicate our mail screening program to all employees so they know the mail is screened? You touched on that with the drugs and illicit substances being mailed to offices. Is there anything more to say about how forthcoming an organization should be about the mail screening internally to their own people?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty subjective, and you can talk with legal folks to figure out how much you want to disclose. I always think it's a good idea to let people know that's going on. And I highlighted some of those reasons earlier. We recommend even using the stamp. If they see that, they're going to know that their stuff's being screened, right? So it's you need to disclose it. I think it works. It has a lot of benefits to it. How much you want to disclose in terms of specifics, that's going to be kind of up for you to decide. We usually just, would say, hey, we've got a robust screening going on. We're taking a look at things. This doesn't eliminate all risk, but we're just trying to increase your safety internally. So we've implemented it for your benefit. And again, it kind of hits all those issues that we discussed earlier.
I'm reminded of a particular incident where inter-office mail was used to transport, a substance from one location to another, one office to another, and so one company inadvertently mailed drugs to themselves, and that seems like a pretty avoidable circumstance with the right screening in place.
Yeah, we want to avoid any inter-office narcotics trafficking if we can.
Absolutely.
So that's a good idea.
So two more questions. The first is about specificity. SOPs are excellent. It's a very long document in some cases, but how specific does an SOP need to be? As I'm writing through this procedure and this process, do I need to account for every square inch of the mailroom or every possible step? How detailed do I need to be in this whole thing?
Yeah, I would say, right, throw down answer. It needs to be as detailed as possible to accomplish what you're trying to set out to do. Let me throw a caveat in there. If you're applying kind of a general guidelines across a corporation, multiple sites, multiple locations, it's not going to be as detailed, right? There's going to be detail in there, but a lot of the processes are kind of going to be simplified because there's going to be so much variance that you can't really create an extremely detailed, robust plan that will fit to every facility. Technology and screening folks and all those types of things, it's hard to replicate all that. If you're doing it for one location and you have one fixed mail room and nothing ever changes, you can be pretty detailed and outlining how you want things to work. So a lot of that will kind of be uncovered when you're doing your risk assessment. One of the things I'll say is when we're building these out for clients that we're interacting with, we'll have our general SOP document. It's going to kind of have broad general guidelines that apply at the corporate level. And then in the appendix, we're going to do site specifics where we take, for instance, a high risk site. We're going to build out specific details that are just relevant for that one location. We're going to throw that in the appendix as an attachment. And basically what that does is it says, hey, everybody else has these guidelines as defined in SOP. But for this one site, you're doing these extra things as well on top of everything else. And that's one way to address some of the details when you have varying sites and locations and security needs.
And that actually sounds like a decent segue into what's the last question here. SOPs are often, compiled into this 200-page, phone book. How do we ensure that employees and personnel actually, read it, understand it, remember it, and apply it? Yeah. Especially under duress. As Will says, humans are great change detectors, but under stress they forget everything. So how is it that we apply SOPs to actually get used, on the floor?
Yeah, I would say probably my go-to answer would be to conduct training like tabletop exercises. Maybe that's something you do once a quarter or twice a year, where you bring all involved parties from your mail screener to your mailroom manager to your security folks, your global security director. You sit down for a few hours. One person's maybe designated to come up with a scenario, and you just walk through various components of that. And I'm talking about being very detailed, maybe even provide some props to use, right? So here's a mail piece that you just received. What would you do? Walk me through how you would interact with this. and let them tell you why things are suspicious, what they notice, what they don't notice, who they would call. If they say, well, I would call my mailroom manager, then that torch gets passed on to that person, and the questioning continues on. Well, what would you do at this point, right? And we just kind of walk through this whole process. That way, if it ever does happen, they've at least gone through the motion and they can kind of compartmentalize that, and in their mind, they can recall it. But I found those to be the best, kind of the best ways outside of doing drills, where you're physically doing stuff and going through the motions, but having a tabletop can be a good way to reinforce that. Just in addition to just regular internal training where you're maybe reinforcing just certain components of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. So I do want to be conscious of people's time. We're just over an hour here. So I want to point out that this session, or this workshop we're doing today, is a version of what is typically the first of 3 detailed SOP sessions. If you got the information you wanted here, but maybe you could use a little more, or you've got some more detailed questions you're not trying to put into a webinar chat, totally understand that. We do offer these privately. Reach out if you'd like to talk to Cody a little bit more detailed. We do go through this in some pretty considerable detail in private sessions, so be happy to do that if anyone's interested. And lastly, we have a whole bunch of resources we could offer. Again, some of you are already customers and clients. Maybe you've seen some of this. For some who are not, we have an entire mail threat database that we publish monthly, where we send out these alerts. Be happy to get you on our email list if you're not already getting those mail alerts. We talk about training on IED detection with our EOD support team. We have training and resource material published by SIA and ASIS with CPP training credits available. So we are a resource for all of the training that Cody mentioned. To have your team bone up on their threat detection information, we can be a valuable resource there. So the last slide here I think we have from you, Cody, since we've gone through all these questions here already. Just contact information. If you'd like to follow up with any of us, we'd be happy to talk more to you. So of course, Cody, our Director of Mail Security, thank you very much for your help today, Cody.
Yep.
My name is TJ. I'm the Communications Director. I can redirect you to anybody you might have questions to, Cody. And of course, there's Will Plum, our EOD Secure and Chief Security Officer. If anybody wants to reach out to Will or any of the 3 of us, there's our contact information. So Cody, before I wrap up, is there any closing thoughts from you on all this?
Nope, just I appreciate your time. Thanks for hanging in there. We packed a lot into a short amount of time. So please reach out if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer specifics or kind of help you wade through some of this. Or if you want to look at maybe doing a full program, we can take care of it as well. But thanks again. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. And as a reminder, we'll be sending out this, this slide deck with Cody's notes. So there'll be much more detail in there than just what you saw on the slides. We can also send out poster 84, the DHS guidelines, all the documentation that you saw referenced in here. We can send your way in addition to a video of this workshop for those that are interested. So please do reach out and we'll be happy to follow up with you. So a few folks saying thank you in the Q&A here. So thank you very much. We're happy to be of service to you and hope everybody have a great day.